Welcome.
It's time for the further adventures of Indiana Jones.
Some of the greatest adventures of my life are sitting in this museum.
Big deal.
Pack your bag, grab your passport, and prepare to go globetrotting with Marvel Comics' classic four-color adventures of Indiana Jones.
Oh, your teacher.
Part-time.
Mr. Henry Jones, Jr. of Princeton, New Jersey.
I like Indiana.
We named the dog Indiana.
Now, what shall we talk about?
Welcome, IndyCast listeners, to the further adventures of Indiana Jones, and we are back. Boy, it feels like a long time since we've done this. I'm Joe Stuber, and joining me once again is Keith Voss.
Hey, Joe, and hello, Further fans. I am looking forward to getting back into talking about Further Adventures. And it looks like Ed has been having a great time doing his 39-step show, and it's good to also have him back with us as well.
Yeah, I know. It seems like forever since we've done this, hasn't it?
It has seemed like forever.
I don't know what I'm doing. I got notes here. I got, everything going on. I've got microphones. I don't know what I'm doing. So,
Yeah.
I don't know about how things are in Austria, but...
It's the same, but, I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to be talking about Further Adventures again, and I'm really glad to introduce our next guest in Club Obi-Wan.
Oh, man, I tell you what, we have just been sort of marching our way through the mighty Marvel Bullpen, which has been a blast for us. We've had so many, Louise Simonson, we've had Walt Simonson, we've had David Michelinie, we've had everybody. But I tell you what, Keith, one person we haven't had who has had a hand in just about every Further Adventures tale. You know what I'm talking about.
I do, and he single-handedly saved the book, too. We're talking about Eliot Brown.
Yeah, editor Eliot Brown. And I tell you what, that's no exaggeration. As you'll see from the interview, we got a two-part interview coming up, but he absolutely did save the book. And I would say he is a very big part of the reason why you and I have this segment on the IndyCast right now and why we've been able to enjoy this book. And we'll see how that plays out in the interview as well.
Absolutely, and it was a blast talking to him. But hey, enough talking about it. Let's let the listeners hear for themselves.
Shall we head into Club Obi-Wan?
We shall.
Well, we're going to extend a big Further Adventures welcome now to our latest guest here in Club Obi-Wan, somebody who had a hand in most of the adventures, the Further Adventures of Indiana Jones books. Assistant editor started out and then became the full-time editor, Mr. Eliot Brown. Mr. Brown, thank you for joining us today on the IndyCast.
Lovely to be here, really and truly.
And
amazing. There's so much interest so many years later.
Oh, there's lots of interest. Yeah, and it's gaining steadily, like the boulder in the beginning of Raiders. It's gaining momentum.
I always loved that thing.
That's great, right?
Yeah, we're talking about these books. I mean, obviously we're going back, a quarter century, but let's even go back before then. When did your interest in comic books first start?
I was a child. I mean, I was a little kid in Boston. And my earliest memory is reading a book called Brain Boy. I know, Brain Boy. And I've been curious to see it since then, but I was sort of afraid to. I saw a moldy cover for like $50. I said, no, I can't afford that. It was about this kid who floated around through the power of his mind. And that's it. I was a goner. That's it. I read all the Batman books I could find. We moved to New York, my mom and I, when I was a kid. At about 5 or 6, and not long after that, she got a job at an ad agency that represented Marvel, and free comic books came pouring in.
Oh my God!
You just said three of our favorite words.
Tell me about it. And also, this was just before. This was roughly 1961, 1962. So this was before the big surge of comic interest. This is when Marvel was on the ropes, but the precursor titles of all of the modern books that we know, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, all of the books just before it were very interesting. The monster books, little stories that stand through together and tossed in the backs of other books, even the funny animal books that nobody knew about, weird stuff like that, all of it. Now, I'd love to say I still have all of those books, Fantastic Four #1, Hulk #1. No, don't have any of them. No, we moved to California about 10 years later, and we can't take those. Oh, that's way too heavy. We can't take those. Oh, don't be silly. Yeah. Oh, well, anyway, that's okay. Who has the last laugh now?
It's interesting. I just heard Michael Uslan had a speaking engagement in Cincinnati recently, and he mentioned those specific comics you did, but he said he kept his, and he had like 30,000 30,000 of them in his garage. He's like, my mom didn't throw them away. She let me keep them all. So,
well, if we hadn't moved, I probably still would have them. But no, we moved. The Pyrrhic victory on my mother's part was that we came back about 8 months later. So, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that we lost were the comics.
The things you wanted.
There was no winning, just that.
Now, at
so
what
that's,
point?
That's really where I was.
How old were you when you first realized, whoa, I could get a paycheck for this?
Ooh, I had a career before my career at Marvel. I was bounced out of college at about 22. Now, my mom had been working at this ad agency for years, and I knew all the guys at Marvel in the mailroom and in the stat department. That's where we did the work. We did the advertising with them, and I met a couple of people and the production guys. When it came time to fill in for one guy, I stepped in. And I worked at Marvel for about a year in 1974, and that was very nice. That was different for me. I was in what's called satisfaction. I was answering subscriptions and mail things, which were all done out of the office back in that point in time, 74, and on the 57th Street offices, 57th and Madison Avenue. And then I got fired because I was working for the wrong person, and we all were swept out of the place. But not before I met everybody. A few years later, I had some really crummy jobs. One place I worked at was a real ad agency that had a complete production department, and I learned how to use a stat camera. Photostat cameras are the Xerox machines of the olden days. And so I took that knowledge, and I was able to, I was back at my mom's office, and I was complaining about this and that, and it was just then one of the other nice ladies who worked there said she knew that Marvel needed a new stat camera operator. That was it. I went over there. It was late 78. I was on staff for 3 months before I actually went full-time for real.
Some good timing there.
Yeah, I was very lucky. And I was 26, and that was it. I was planning on being a lifer. Stay there forever.
And what's great about this is people can actually take a look at this, what you're talking about, because if you go to your website, EliotRBrown.com, you've got those pictures from '79, the bullpen, the famous Marvel bullpen.
I started taking pictures like a nut, and I've just started scanning them literally in the last couple of years and putting them together and trying to figure out the best way to present them and, make it nice for everybody.
Pre-Indiana Jones, what were you working on at Marvel?
I was concentrating on being the world's best assistant. I was production. Just before I was trying to spruce myself up. I was coming out of production for the previous couple of years, a little rough and ready. T-shirts, dungarees. I put on shirts. I took showers more often. I shaved. I tried to be presentable. And I was in one of the other things I learned at that old ad agency was using a typesetting computer. Now, in 1977, 78, 79, those computers were pretty funky. They were big and mechanical, which is hard to believe. They weren't like adding machines, but they were. They did have solid state computer elements that we would recognize today, but it had the screen is a 9-inch monochrome screen, for example. And this is a $20,000 machine. But I did know how to use it, and that made all the difference in the world. So I stepped in and I tried to be a typesetter. I was finally made a typesetter just in time for the Marvel Universe to come along. So I was doing Marvel Universe at one point when Marvel moved downtown. That's when Tom DeFalco asked me to be his assistant. Literally, we were right in the thick of all this. The three balls in the air were moving, typesetting by day, and doing the Marvel Universe by night. And then Tom asks me to be his assistant, so I had to give up literally that day job and switch to another day job. That's when I became an assistant.
So for all our listeners that don't know what an assistant editor at Marvel does.
Ooh, good question. We did all the scut work. We did all the little stuff. We trafficked the book around. We followed the pages. We, the editor took the first pass, proofing the book, and then we, fixing things, changing things, moving the art around. Then we made sure it happened, and then we proofed it again and to make sure everything was beautiful, and checked the coloring, make sure everything fit Coloring was a different process back then. It was done by hand. When the books were printed, there was a very strange version of the book made from the negatives, which was a weird science. I could probably do it in front of you, but it's like a magic trick. I couldn't tell you how it's done. You take these huge sheets of paper and you fold them exactly so, and you'll get a comic book. That's how you figured out if the pages were printed in the right order. I know it sounds very strange just describing it, but that's how we did it. You didn't know until it was off the presses and on the streets.
You guys were actually doing some manual labor on this thing, then.
Yes, quite a lot of it. Well, every once in a while, we all wanted to do everything, so we would make changes ourselves. If we weren't good enough at lettering, we'd actually beg favors and buck the system and get through production. I mean, my ties to production were very strong, and I loved those guys. They loved me. My buddy, the stat camera operator. In fact, you know the guy's name, Robbie Carosella, was a colorist on my books when I was to flash forward a little bit to the Indiana Jones era. I used the Indiana Jones titles to give him a chance to be a colorist. It turns out he didn't like it, but he did want to try, and he was my buddy in the stat office for years. And we're still in touch. We're still friendly. He was a very nice guy. Liked him. I thought he was talented. This will give you an idea of what a magical time this was. Even after we'd moved from 575 Madison on 57th Street down to 387 Park Avenue South on 27th Street, we had Marie Severin with us. And Robbie and Marie were chummy enough so that he could go to her and ask her for advice. And that's one of the reasons his first book, the Dave Mazzucchelli story, which I think is, 16? That can't be right. 20, 19? It was my first title as an editor, so I think it might have been 20, 19. Anyway.
Your issue 14 was your first, at least 14. credited as the full editor. Up till then, issue 13 I think was your last as assistant editor.
Yeah, right.
Which issue did you start with as assistant editor?
Because it was Danny Fingeroth, I think, before you, correct?
Yeah, Danny was before. I think Danny was there for 6 issues before I stepped in. I really no, that's where the books have to tell the tale. I can't remember.
Okay.
And even more confusing, remember there's a delay in when we send the books to the presses and it gets printed of about 3 months. So it's even more confusing.
That's the tough part for us to figure out because the letters column comes in, and I think Danny was still listed as assistant editor, but it might have been a crossover with your time. So somewhere probably, around I would think 6 or 7.
If he did the work, I would have let him get the credit. So even if I was the assistant, I had nothing to do with that particular issue. I'd make sure he got the credit. So that's how that worked.
How did you come about getting involved in the world of Indiana Jones then?
I was always a fan of action adventure. Doc Savage, an old pulp hero, was an early influence. I didn't read a lot of pulp stuff, but I saw all the old movies. I used to watch serials when I was a kid. I used to watch Ronald Reagan. Actually, there's a Ronald Reagan movie. I cannot remember the name for the life of me. That is the prototype.
Ronald Reagan, the actor?
That's right. What, Jack Benny, the treasurer? Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
I should have known better to get you two started on Back to the Future references.
It's true. He was a prototype Indiana Jones. Exactly the same look. In an old movie from, I believe, the 40s. He had the exact same flying jacket, fedora, the same military cut shirt, and it's just it's weird to see this movie. I wish I could remember the name. I should have done a little bit more homework.
I can hear our listeners Googling right now as we speak.
So, yeah. And wait till you see these pictures. You'll understand where Spielberg came from for the movie.
So your interest was there, but how was the book presented to you? Because that's just a fantastic opportunity at that time.
Did you actively seek it out, or
no? No. I was lucky that I was in the DeFalco office, which was Spider-Man and several Spider-Man titles and a couple of other titles that escape me now. But we did very well. We enjoyed what we did, and Tom. I thought I worked very well with Tom, and I have no idea what he thinks. But he suggested me to Louise when Danny wanted to go off and be a writer. And Louise said, sure. And Wheezy Jones is one of these characters, one of these female editors that you'd think would be made into a movie all by herself. She's an epic person, and it's a shame she was in such a whirl at the time of business and work and family life. I mean, she had a growing daughter at home, so she was very busy all the time. She'd make a great interview aside from Indiana Jones, but she decided to take me on. Now, the best thing about Wheezy, as far as I was concerned, I was just as much interested in the Star Wars books at the time. Star Wars, science fiction and Star Wars is a bit more my interest, but I liked the Indiana Jones stuff just as well. But it had a life of its own. It was barreling along as far as I could tell. Wheezy had a strong hand on the book in the form of David Michelinie. And I can't overstress this enough. I'm looking at the books again and I realize, oh yeah, that's what Dave was trying to do. I was a little less complex back then. I'm a bit better now, a little more sophisticated. I see what Dave was trying to do. If I'm not getting too much ahead of myself in the story here, I realize now what I objected to about Dave, and I wanted to change because I thought he'd had a nice run, a couple of years. When I became editor, I wanted to change, and I thought he overwrote. That's the only thing. There were too many words. So that was the biggest problem as far as Dave Michelinie. But what he wrote was terrific. So his storylines were very true to the basic concept of an adventurer scientist, which was Indiana Jones. That's my feeling about Michelinie. But he was in good shape. He himself was in good shape. Louise liked him, nurtured him, gave him good people to work with. After Byrne decided to leave for whatever reasons he did, John was another force in nature, big, very powerful guy at the time, could do whatever he wanted pretty much. Probably if he had been told no under almost any circumstances, he would have decided to leave.
Yeah,
that's why.
Let's step back to some of those early issues of the book
Sure.
you had when you were assistant editor, because you mentioned it seemed like, at least to us, that there was a little bit of turmoil at the beginning of the book with Byrne coming on and then leaving so quickly.
Yeah.
Gene Day coming in as penciler, who was, in our opinion, a creative genius. Just
it really
his
showed.
Layouts would break through the panels and things like that. But unfortunately, I believe he died in the middle of penciling the book.
Could well have, yeah.
What was your
issue
take
number
as
3.
assistant editor through those early issues?
Well, the assistants were the sword carriers. We did the editor would lift a finger and we would make it so. It was very hard to. There was a definite class structure in the office, which is kind of hard to. This is the secrets behind the comics. You're never going to hear this from anybody else except the Bullpen. All the lower guys looking up will say this, and all the upper guys looking down will deny it. But I'm one of the few guys who started at the bottom and made my way up, so I can look from both directions at the same time. And what I saw was the assistants were not really turned to back then. There was a time when the assistants became, as they stayed on longer and longer, they became more valuable. But they were pretty much seen as either stepping stones to being a writer. You worked in the office for a while, like a Danny Fingeroth, who went on to be an editor, and then he left staff to be a writer. It was seen as a fast track to proving yourself. You obey the law for a while. You do what you're told. You don't make any major screw-ups, and then you become an editor. You do that for a couple of years, then you become a writer. And freelance, being what it was in those days, if you had a couple of books, it was a good living. If you were a writer, you could do 4 or 5 books a month. If you were a penciler or an inker, you could do 1 or 2 and do very, very well. Those were the days. Milk and honey flowed, wonderful stuff. But my take as an assistant with Louise was so well versed in dealing with the creative people. I mean, she herself is a very creative person. If you've seen any of her recent stuff, even stuff for kids, she's just in there. She has a deft touch, clever turn of phrase. She's very smart with how the story progresses. She could help and point a writer. She'd have them in a couple of times. She'd speak to them. Then they'd go off and spinning like tops, and their pages would just fly out of them. So, and for a guy like Michelinie, that's saying something, because he type-wrote every page. The scripts came in beautifully finished. I mean, he had to retype stuff over and over again to make it look as pretty as he did. We're talking mechanical typewriters. Remember this. These were the good old days. A guy like DeFalco, by contrast, when he wrote, he would cut apart sheets of paper and scotch tape them together to make corrections. So he would hand this thing in that looked like a Christmas tree, full of paper all over the place, and whiteout chipping off and old hand notations all over. But Michelinie's were perfect. He had to work to get that to happen, and I think what I did was strictly make the pages march through the bullpen. That's really what I did.
That's kind of what I wanted. That's what I want to touch on is your relationship then with Louise and the talent. You mentioned some of the writers and artists around the book. What was the dynamic between yourself, Louise, and then the talent on the book through those first issues with your time as assistant, and then we'll move into editor later?
I had very little to do with Indiana Jones because Michelinie would come in and he would breeze through the office and talk to Louise, and then he'd leave. I had literally nothing to say, no reason to speak up, and he didn't come in that often because he was it took him all day to type and retype stuff. That's a joke. That's a joke. But there more of this hierarchy, as I was pointing out. It wasn't really my place to say anything. At the end of my time with Louise, I felt comfortable speaking to Chris Claremont, who was doing New Mutants and that sort of thing, X titles. But that's because I'd been to dinner with Chris a few times. You know, we'd all go out on Friday nights and whoop it up. We'd visit with one guy named Ralph who lived at home and had a pool, and we'd go in the afternoons and just hang out, and Chris would come along. So I felt a little closer to Chris, but that was an exception. I generally tried to let Louise do what she wanted. I was there as a secondary character at best, more like a tertiary character. That's what I felt my place was. I had a different dynamic with Tom, for example, where Tom would actively seek my opinion. He said, "Well, what do you think of this? What do you think of that?" And I'd tell him, he'd give me the script to read, whereas Louise wouldn't necessarily give me the script to read. It depends on how busy she was. Tom would do that as a matter of course. So I had more of a feedback relationship with Tom and some of the other writers, but not so much with Louise. Didn't need it. I thought Louise felt she was completely in charge and in control. She had her own thing going. She was perfectly happy with it. Even if what's reflected in the books is chaos, she was calm. As far as I was concerned, my job was to get the pages through the bullpen. So whatever chaos came up in the office was me, whacking heads and yelling at people and carrying on in the bullpen to get stuff done. Which sounds funny, but that's kind of what I did.
Did you have a specific take on the character itself? Because you mentioned to us off-air in the Marvel team's first viewing of Raiders of the Lost Ark when the whole team went and saw. And
yeah, we went to the movie, yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that and what you took away from that experience that you were able to bring to the book.
I felt... Well, first off, we went with... The one character in particular I remember going with us was Mark Gruenwald, the late lamented Mark Gruenwald, and his first wife. And she looked at us like she was ready to give us a Three Stooges slap right across the face, bap, 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 because she said, "This is what you guys should have been writing." She was right. And it's because this is what we talked about all the time. We talked about adventure scientists, and Gruenwald and I had a crazy idea years ago, which we let drop dead, which was just about that. Scientists who adventured across dimensions technologically. They would go in spacesuits because they didn't know what atmospheres they'd be encountering. That sort of crazy scientist stuff. And we all felt an affinity for the action adventure stuff because that's basically what we wrote and edited and thought about all day long. Ordinary people placed in extraordinary situations, or more to the point, placing themselves in extraordinary situations, going to the trouble of putting themselves in trouble. That's what we saw as the fun part.
What did you see in the movie and the character specifically of Indiana Jones that you were able to bring? What were you able to bring to the table as far as that's concerned?
There's another aspect of this that you have to remember is that we had one of the things that was drummed into our heads because of the Micronauts. When I was Louise's assistant, we had the Micronauts, which was a licensed product. We had Star Wars, of course, licensed, and Indiana Jones. three very different licensing entities. You know, the people in charge were very different. And they all had the same concerns. We couldn't do anything. That having been said, we wanted to do the limits of craziness that we could. In fact, you'll see that Michelinie is pretty clever in making use of the characters, which was his downfall, but much more clever in making use of little bits of myth and legend and El Dorado and Shangri-La, crystal this and golden that, and he was able to pull the fantastic elements in. He unfortunately grounded them to people that were characters in the movies, and that was the problem. He had this thing about Abner Ravenwood, and they didn't want that, no matter how. And so he's playing with it. You can see him playing with it in the story. It's Abner. It's not. It is. It isn't. Wrinkles, roomy eyes. It is. It is. No, it's not. It can't be.
Well, then that brings us then to the relationship with Lucasfilm reps and what. Yeah, I say Lucasfilm, and then immediately
you may have opened up a can of worms there.
A can of worms there. What was the relationship like with Lucasfilm reps and the focus on what you got approved as far as storyline?
With Louise, I mean, Louise actually went to visit those people. You know, she saw them, she talked to them, and she realized early on. I mean, she had worked for a major publisher, and so she knew the limits. Who was that? Jim Warren. She had worked for Jim Warren in Creepy Magazine, and he had in turn worked with Hollywood guys, and he would tell her, you know, mad dog stories about all the things he tried to do and couldn't do, and she was always shy about stuff, but she didn't want to hold back the writers, the creative elements. She came in with a set of strictures. We couldn't advance any of the characters. We could have them walk around in circles, but we could not make them advance. We couldn't even get Indiana Jones to advance. All we could do is echo what was on the screen with no harbingers of anything to happen, because we might have run into a storyline that they were developing. Or even close.
It also seems like that's something they want to save for the films, like, you know, for example, his father coming in, or, you know, the introduction of his son. Exactly.
Do you recall anything specifically that it was going to go into the book for Further Adventures, but Lucasfilm just kind of put the brakes on it?
You know what? It's funny. There's something bubbling up, but it ain't there. There was something that was talked about in my presence, and I'm sorry to keep saying this, but I wish I could remember better.
No, I mean, we're going back quite a ways. Was it involving a character or a scenario, possibly?
It was a direction. In fact, I'm sure it had to do with more Abner stuff. That's why the best archaeological uncovering of what can and can't be done, or what could be done, is what's hinted at in the storylines that are printed.
Well, you brought it up. Is that Abner? I mean, we asked Michelinie, and he couldn't give us a...
Yeah, I'm sure it was. It had something to do with Abner.
In the comic book itself, as the editor, do you think that was it your take that was Abner? Because it's very, as you mentioned, it's very mysterious in the book.
It's got to be. It's got to be. It was something that that Michelinie wanted to do with Marion and Abner, and they said no. That much, it's got to be.
But do you think
that much I feel I can say.
Do you think the mysterious character that's in that issue? Do you feel that was Abner?
Oh, I see. Yeah, sure.
Why not, right?
You just made our day.
Well, yeah,
That's good.
I mean, it makes a better story.
Keith,
and,
we now have official confirmation.
We now have official confirmation.
This just in.
Abner is not dead.
Abner is not dead. We're getting it straight from the source.
Well, no, he still could be dead, you see. There has to be a priest's hole that he rolls down into, because remember they set off the dynamite, remember?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Could have been, might have been, not maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
Keith, we were so
Don't
close.
Quote me.
So close.
Keith, we were so close.
Yeah, I know.
It's okay. It's okay.
We'll do a radio drama with Abner.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Yes, you should. There should be. He was Indiana Jones's mentor, after all.
That's right.
Okay, so issue 13, your last issue as assistant editor, we interviewed Louise Simonson. She said when she left the book with 13, she left it in very good hands, and that that's why she was able to walk away from it, was that she left it in very capable hands, those hands being obviously yours. What does that mean to you to know that she was able to do that, and what do you think you did that was able to convince her that, hey, I'm good?
Oh,
We're
no.
good on this?
I wish I'd demonstrated some capability. We were sitting in an editorial meeting, and all the editors and assistants and shooter, and they were saying they wanted to cancel Indiana Jones unless somebody else wanted to take it over.
At issue 14?
Well, this would be before then.
Wow.
This would be before at least a couple of issues before, because you can't just pick up the reins and keep riding that horse. I mean, you've got to make plans, especially if we worked months in advance.
So there was talk of pulling the plug way early on this book. What was?
Oh yeah.
Why did that come about? Where did that discussion come from?
Licensed titles are really trouble, especially when something is big and hot like Indiana Jones was. Lucasfilm was very protective. Not Lucasfilm so much as I believe it was MCA, Merchandising Corporation of America. I forget who actually handled the licensing, but they were very protective. They kept sending notes back. I mean, I remember. I'm pretty sure Michelinie had to rewrite stuff several times. The plots. I mean, you may or may not know how comics were done in those days. You could send in a plot. The artist would draw it, and then the writer would write the script on top of the artwork. So it was a multi-step procedure. That's when there was plenty of time. Those were in the good old days when we actually had a schedule that we would fight to keep. That fell apart pretty quickly in the next 10 years or so, 81, 82 to 91, 92. And people were working on pencils and Xeroxes and things like that. It would get pretty rough. You'd be doing entire books and then lettering them, for example. But back then, we tried to do the lettering on the board. It was a mark of shame to have to do the lettering on a paste-up, on a piece of tracing paper that you would cut apart and stick down on the boards. And if you ever see original boards, you'll see that, and it's a mark of shame. A little bit before, and the lettering would have been done in ink on the board. That's when we had lots of time in our schedule.
So problematic at that point. Then they're talking about pulling the plug on the book. Does anybody want to take it over? So it's just a matter of who wants to deal with this monster.
And well, there I was. I said, I don't know why. I mean, I must have had a pitchfork sticking me in the back. I just jumped and said, I'd like to do it. And I wish.
Well, 25 years later, retroactively, we thank you.
Yes.
Well, it's very nice of you guys. But I'll tell you, I'm looking at the covers and I'm looking at the credits. The first thing that Louise did, she gives me this book by Dave Mazzucchelli. Dave has penciled it, and she says this was his sample book that he sent in. He had taken a script from Michelinie, and he had done this as a sample. And Dave Mazzucchelli is an incredible artist, and the pencils were gorgeous. And she said, you can use this as your first book to buy some time. Because it was all done. Pencils were done. And then she went on to say, try Vince Colletta. And I said, well, Vinny Colletta, geez, I mean, Vinny is a great guy. All right, I'll try that. And Vince was available. The trouble was a terribly short deadline. That's right. That's by the time I took it over, we were late. Let me speak to you a little bit about schedules.
Just let me backtrack 1 second. Is that why the credit there for inker says the Saint?
Yeah. I don't know what I don't know what's in Vinny's head, but whatever he wanted, I gave it to him. I mean,
okay.
Vinny was funny.
That explains that credit a little bit. We're talking about issue 14.
That is Vinny Colletta. If you take a look at the most recognizable thing about Vincent is his lips. He draws lips the same way, over and over. And you can also see there's a chin line that he does, a perfect chin line for men and women alike. And that's Vinny in a nutshell. He did that book in from a Friday to a Monday. He must have had some background people helping him out, but he killed himself. I mean, this is an older guy, and he just did it. Now, that's trouble with Vinny is I hope I'm not telling too many tales out of school, but Vinny was famous for doing an excellent job on the first book, and then kind of slacking off from then on. Once he had the book, it was too familiar. But that Mazzucchelli job was terrific. Mostly Vinny, with just a little help on some of the background details. Like every once in a while, there's a couple of weak trees and some vehicles in the background. He didn't do
issue 14 on issue 14. You mean?
Yeah. The Mazzucchelli story. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great story. I'm a big fan of it.
Really?
14.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Really. Yeah. I enjoyed that. Unfortunately, that came to an end, and immediately we went on to trying to. I wanted to get rid of Michelinie. because I thought first off, that was the prerogative of a new editor, which I wanted to exercise. I wanted to use Herb Trimpe. I mean, Herb was a chum. We'd met in the office. We talked. We had many similar interests in an affection and affinity for the 30s and 40s. You can tell in most of Herb's work that he loved dwelling on the old ships and the submarines and the planes. He was crazy for a dogfight sequence. He poured his heart into things like that. He could tell a story. He could draw like nobody's business. It was good. He lived and breathed in the 30s and 40s, like few others, like Chaikin did as well. But I thought his stuff was more, Herb's stuff was more natural. Chaikin's stuff was very stylized. The only problem with Herb is that he wanted to ink himself. So it was kind of hard to work with pencils because when you ink yourself, you don't need to do tight pencils. So it was harder to figure out the storyline from his pencils. Right. Not by much. But Michelinie didn't want to be kicked off the book. Herb wanted to write his own stuff as well, and I had no problem with that. That's exactly what I wanted. In that regard, Herb and I were simpatico, and Michelinie and I were sort of, not happy with each other. He might have seen me as an upstart and a punk, which, given, done, okay. And I saw him as a bit of a stodgy writer. He overworked stuff. He would kill the letterers. If you take a look at the amount of acreage in the pages devoted to lettering, there's a lot of dialogue going on, a lot of textual stuff going on in there, which I didn't think was necessary. I thought even now, I look back and I reread a few things, I see that it could have been boiled down, made simpler, made less wordy. But Dave liked to write, and he wrote. Not bad, just I wanted something different. In fact, I very much like Dave's storylines now. In retrospect, I think they're pretty good. I wish Louise had reined him in a little bit more, or myself. Once I was, Dave wanted to stay on the books and take advantage of the next movie coming out because that would cause a spike in sales and you get a little bit more out of the incentive program at Marvel, which these days we call it a royalty system. But Marvel used a different phrase for legal purposes, and so they got incentive over everything over 100,000 copies. You got a percentage of the cover price, and it would, as it went up above whatever it was, 110, 120, you'd get a slightly larger percentage. So that's what he wanted to take advantage of. I don't blame him, but and I felt compelled to keep him on. I mean, he went to Shooter, and Shooter interceded on his behalf, which is that's okay. It's all politics.
Apparently, you wanted to contribute to one of the issues more in a writing sense.
I'm glad you prompted me. Just before I became the editor, I had this crazy idea. I said, "Wheezy, I got an idea for an Indiana Jones bit. I don't know what to do with it yet." And the idea of the story was that he's on a blimp, and at the time it would have been the Hindenburg or one of the other ones, one of the other cruise liners that the German Republic had been running around, and I wanted Indiana Jones to have to get off. So he would parachute off the blimp. Then when he's on the ground, something would transpire. I mean, maybe he's over a city, maybe he's over the outskirts and the suburbs, Chicago. I mean, I can't imagine where this would have had to have happened. He had to get back on, and it was the fun part of getting back on. I had been fooling around looking up blimps during between the wars, and the American blimp corps, the Army Air Corps, had little planes that would hook on to the underside of their large blimps. They could leave and land and the whole thing and climb back on and all sorts of stuff. It was a hanging trapeze gadget that the plane had a little hook on it, and they dropped from the blimp and they flew away, and then they flew back and got picked up again. So I saw that and I thought, well, that's what I want to do, except this, of course, is the German luxury liner, and there is no such thing. So how do you do that? And what I figured out was that he'd find this barnstormer guy and he'd say, "Hey, listen, Okie, I got to get up there. Can you help me?" And the guy says, "Well, that's the craziest thing I've ever done." He takes off in a biplane, and either Indy would wing walk and get flipped up into an open compartment or the engine outrigger, on a blimp, or or the barnstormer would turn upside down and hook his landing wheels on something hanging down. I'm not sure what yet, a staircase or I don't know what. And then Indiana would climb up, which made more graphic sense. But then, of course, so I said this to Wheezy, and she says, "Oh, that sounds great. Now figure out the rest of the story." And then I think it was a month later, a month, when I opened up my mouth in that stupid meeting, and she says, "Oh, Eliot, you can't write anymore. You can't write for the book anymore. You're the editor." Oh, that's right. I forgot.
So you don't actually have the way you're describing. You don't actually have a whole story written out. You just have more notes or ideas.
I have no idea why he would want to get on that thing in the first place, or get off and then have to get back on again. Sounded like fun. At the time I had vague notions about a spy who clears his name, and then he's on the ground and he runs into somebody, or the G-men, or he makes a call or something, and he says, "You got the wrong guy." And he says, "Oh, no, we got the right guy. What are you doing? You got to go stop him." And then he says, "Oh, yeah, I got to stop him." He's already jumped off the blimp. That's what's funny. Now, why he had to jump off, I don't know. But once again, I didn't figure that out.
We do, on the IndyCast, we do these radio dramas in the style of old radio shows, and we've adapted a couple.
To one, yes.
Yeah, what'd you think of it?
Very nice to hear. It's being carried on. It's a lovely tradition. And it sounded great.
Thanks.
I'm thinking
we really
a lost
appreciate that.
Eliot Brown tale. I don't know.
Yeah, we might have to adapt a Lost Eliot Brown
It's very
tale.
exciting. Very exciting. Well, I'd love to collaborate anytime anybody wants to figure out a storyline.
That sounds good.
I freely give you my story elements. That's fine.
We will freely take them.
Excellent.
Wow, what a great way to kickstart that interview with Eliot Brown. What do you think, Keith?
Sure was. And how about those ideas that he had?
Again, it kind of reminds me of the Michelinie interview we had, where he mentioned these concepts that he had for the book. And boy, there's just those indie tales out there that just haven't been completed.
I was salivating is the word.
I'm thinking radio drama. I'm thinking there's so much that we can do with these things. But I tell you what, one other thing I liked about the interview was the background. We got into the dynamic between Eliot and Michelinie.
Yeah. Sounds like a little bit of a little fallout there.
I mean, you kind of see those books, and we know how volatile things got back in the '80s in the Mighty Marvel Bullpen, and I guess we can look back at these things and figure out that they really resulted in some great tales. That's what we can get out of these things. But boy, the drama behind the scenes, it's kind of interesting to get a background look at that.
The more that we talk to these people that were in the Mighty Marvel Bullpen, the more we're finding out, like, wow, there really was a lot of conflict going on there.
Politics.
Politics. It's crazy. And, but they made for great stories.
And it gives me, and I don't know about you, but it gives me a perception, too, of the characters is that, we love to see the stories advanced, but we kind of get that information there that, they even though Lucasfilm wasn't as totally micromanaging on this book as they were with Star Wars, they couldn't advance the characters completely. So there was a little bit of handcuffing.
Everything at some point was just going in circles, and I think that's one of the biggest hindrances that the book had, unfortunately. Yeah. But as the series progressed, we did get some new sidekicks, some new characters, brought back a few old ones. So
it forced them to get creative. I mean, it forced them to get as creative as they could within those confines. So it gives me a little bit of better appreciation of the book as well. One of those examples, Abner Ravenwood. What'd you think about that? Talk about breaking news.
Especially for fans of the series, like, was he or wasn't he? And me personally, I think it was. I think it was something cool to bring to the book.
Yeah.
But I personally think it was Abner. What about you?
Yeah, I think it was too, and I think we got some confirmation there, didn't we?
I think we did.
Can we close that? Can we close the book on that?
I don't. No, let's not. It still remains a cool mystery. I mean, it's like exposing like Boba Fett as being a clone. Like, we always like that guy as being a mystery, and who is the guy under the helmet? It's the same thing with this Abner character. Who is the guy under the mask? Is it really him? Is it not? I don't want a definitive answer.
It was Abner.
I want to. Yeah, right. It was Abner, but I still want to.
It was Abner, and you know what? And thanks to Eliot Brown too for saving the book. Yeah. I mean, really, that's one of our favorite comic book series of all time.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like he saved it somewhere between. We didn't get a specific issue. It looks like he saved it somewhere maybe between 10 and 13.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
But he saved it, and we got 24 more issues out of it, guys. So
Yeah, I mean, if you like the series, go to EliotRBrown.com, get in touch with Eliot, and thank him. Thank him for saving that series, for stepping up to the plate, and really knocking a home run, knocking it right out of the park.
He was a lot of fun to talk to, and it gets even more interesting in part 2 of our interview. So
good stuff coming up in part 2.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff coming up.
Eliot's time with a legend, a Marvel legend, and also I think we've got a new character, Massachusetts Brown.
Massachusetts Brown. That's right.
We'll find out more about that. And that was a really cool part in part 2. We've got a lot of emails coming in on issue number 4.
That's right. I think we're going to maybe save those for when we actually review issues 4 and 5 as a storyline.
I think that's a good idea, because some of our listeners have had some really good insight into those issues.
Absolutely.
So keep them coming in. We want to make sure we get those emails on those issues, or whatever your favorite issue is. Send it in. We'll read it. I mean, we're gonna go through each issue at a time. So send those in. Get those. Keith, where can they send an email?
Oh, they can send those emails to thefurtheradventures@gmail.com. And if you also want to drop us a line on our Facebook page, just look up The Further Adventures on Facebook. We're there.
We're having some fun on Facebook, and we're going to look forward to talking to Eliot Brown again in part 2. Hopefully everybody will enjoy the rest of that. The next time on
The Further Adventures of Indiana Jones.